we start. I'll start off with the introductions while everybody else is still coming on board. Welcome today to our ParaBoss webinar. For those of you who are new to ParaBoss, welcome. It's lovely to have you here. ParaBoss is Australia's resource for the control of worms, flies, lice and ticks. And it's a joint initiative put together by Australian Wool Innovation, Meat and Livestock Australia, the University of New England and Animal Health Australia. And today we're going to be doing a seasonal worm update, predominantly in sheep, but we'll have a little bit of information for everybody. And our presenter, who I'll introduce more formally to you in a moment, is Dr. Besier. My name's Fiona MacArthur, for those of you who haven't met me, and I work with the ParaBoss Extension team. So for those of you who don't know Brown, which seems hard to believe because he's certainly been involved with our industry, he's a bit of a legend in it. He's now a private consultant, though he's done a fair few things throughout his career, and he works in different part of agricultural industries. He works with BarboVax, with the sheep vaccine for Barber's poleworm. He works with different projects for Meat and Livestock Australia and Australian Wool Innovation, and of course he is on our ParaBoss technical committee as well. So it's great to have him here today. He's based in Albany, down in southern WA. So he has a very interesting insight to worms over there as well. So I've got your presentation up on screen now, Brown. It's great to have you here. I'll let you take it away.
Okay, yep, thanks, Fiona. Yep, good to be back on a webinar, and seems like I'm sort of speaking to people a long way from where I am in WA, and certainly the bottom end of WA. So, seasonal sheepworm update. What I'm going to talk about today is basically tools that are useful through pretty much any time of worm control, but particularly autumn has a key role in planning worm control programs in pretty much any region that we're in. So I was going to talk about why autumn is a key time of the year for worm control, but then we'll talk about monitoring worm egg counts, planning worm safe pastures, and checking for drench resistance. Now, these are all, I'm sure, standard elements of any worm control program that people have, but I guess the idea is to update with where we are with the new information, or simply to try and put things in a bit of context. So they're the three main tools that we'll talk about. And simply like to say that I'm totally independent, not affiliated with any company, with the exception of BarboVax. So I am involved with the Barber's poleworm vaccine, but I guess I'm off the hook because I'm not talking about BarboVax today. So let's kick it off and talk about why autumn is a key time of year for worm control. And we'll talk a bit about how it affects worms in each of several major environmental regions around Australia. But I guess a couple of points is that basically what happens in autumn regarding worms, whether it's worm numbers are going up or down, pretty much determines what's happening later in the year for the next few seasons. Obviously, a very different pattern of rainfall through summer in west versus east. So over here in the west where I am, we've had an extraordinarily dry summer and some really hot temperatures. So pretty much frying worms on the pasture. But pretty different story for large parts of the east, where many people have had, of course, average rainfall and some a lot more than average rainfall. And basically, where there's green pasture, so my bottom point there, where there's green pasture, there's always a worm risk. I guess the key point there is part of the worm life cycle, that the worms are laying eggs which come out in the sheep dung. So the worm eggs hitting the pasture in a sheep pellet or a cow pat or from any animal need a certain amount of moisture for them to develop through to the larval stage, and then that larval stage to be able to move out. They need moisture to move out onto the pasture. So pretty much green pasture is an indicator that there's a potential at least for worms to develop. Now, if the green pasture then gets hit with, say, hot summer conditions and dies off, larvae will eventually die, but the worm larvae on the pasture are pretty tough creatures, and they'll survive even when things are looking dry. Eventually they will die. So hot, dry summers in especially say cropping zones are pretty lethal for even the larvae. But it all starts somewhere, so we need green pasture as the kick-off point for worms to develop. Then really it's a question of how long those larvae survive. We'll pick this up again when we talk about creating worm-free or worm-safe pastures. So looking at area by area, I'm going to go through three main areas: summer rainfall, winter rainfall, sort of temperate areas, and then the Mediterranean areas. So quite plainly, as no one in these areas, of course, needs reminding of their local conditions, but simply make sure we're all on the same page. Barber's pole worm, of course, is the key problem worm species in well, especially occurring in summer and through in autumn. So we've got a few weeks to run before Barber's pole hits the roadblock of really cold weather, and it depends, of course, just how cold it is. If you're in tropical sort of areas, then maybe there's no time of the year when it's cold enough at all for Barber's pole to stop. And certainly in the tropical zones of the world, Barber's pole worm is just an ever-present risk that people have to contend with, and in fact makes the running of small ruminants pretty hard in those parts of the world. But I guess the main thing we need to be mindful of now is that we've got a gauntlet to run until cooler weather occurs in those areas where that's going to be the limiter. The main recommendation simply has to be that we're monitoring worm egg counts, given that Barber's pole comes out of the blue with very little warning, before quite often simply dead sheep. I suppose one guide we can use is where there's been previous outbreaks, then we know that there's always the potential there'll have been contamination of pastures with worm eggs, so it's going to be that issue. I'll talk about the occurrence of previous outbreaks and probably make the point that the particular paddock where an outbreak occurs is always going to be the worst on the farm for leaving those sheep. And often people in the facing a situation like that will say, well, I'd like to move the sheep out, but I haven't got any worm-free or worm-safe pastures. And the thing is that the paddock where an outbreak occurs is always going to be the worst. So whatever you do, you must move the sheep out of there. Whatever paddock they go into, it's not going to be as bad as one that's been hit with millions and billions of worm eggs hitting the deck and making it potentially really bad news for sheep staying there. But in addition, we're also looking at situations like an estimate of the worm situation. Sheep class has a lot to do with the frequency of monitoring worm egg counts. Younger stock in general, more susceptible. Lactating ewes, more susceptible. Weather and past conditions, if things have been fairly dry, things will dry down. An inch of rain, and then Barber's pole will be looking happy again. In general terms, for weekly, if you're monitoring, if you're in an area where Barber's pole is known to be active and there's a likelihood going by all your guesstimate of the likely conditions. If you're looking at situation sheep have been drenched and everything you see that Barber's pole's not immediately active, 4 to 6 weeks, going much longer than that, and certainly you can be risking things. Anyone, of course, who's living with Barber's pole as a routine knows that Barber's pole has little warning before there's problems, and people will be matching their frequency of worm egg counting according to a risk. But it comes back to making some guesstimate of what that risk is. I guess areas with cold winters, so I guess we're talking particularly tablelands and inland areas where winters are cold enough to shut down Barber's pole worm egg development. There's the opportunity then to prepare our situation for coming into spring, where it's spring lambing. I'll talk more about that when we talk about developing safe pastures. Turning now to winter rainfall zones, the main problems here, of course, are the scour worms, brown stomach worms, so the Tildasagia ostatagia group. Black scour worm is Trichostrongylus. These are pretty much through all the winter rainfall zones are the main problems. There's a few other worms involved as well. Basically, where there's been green pasture through summer, and there were certainly parts who have received heavy summer rain, likelihood of problems right through summer and autumn comes into time of a second summer drench, some will have been given. This is certainly the year where, if people are thinking, do I really need to, in particular groups, give a second summer drench? And this obviously depends very much on your past history. This is going to be the year, I think, for a lot of people that you need to check an egg count to quickly sort that out. But certainly damping down the potential for carrying worms into autumn is a good idea. Because once we get into autumn, the idea is that we must have worm egg counts down to a very low level, because that's the base where worms are going to kick off. Bearing in mind that the scour worms, unlike Barbus poleworm, do like, in fact, they thrive under cool conditions. So cool, wet conditions is what kicks off the black scour and brown stomach worms. So we need low worm egg counts in all sheep classes, especially young stock, and especially ewes prior to lambing. And ewes that are going to be lambing in autumn, the ones where you do need to sort of check round about now or within the next month or so to check that their counts are down there at a very low point. They may not need a pre-lamb drench, depending on the action that's taken now, if a drench is needed, or indeed if the counts have been low through summer. But we need to know that the ewes are going to be lambing without heavy worm burdens, because over lactation they temporarily lose their worm immunity, and we can see large worm burdens develop, problems occur over lactation. They spontaneously recover their immunity, but if at lambing time they have a large burden, then that'll only increase over lactation. In the Barbus pole areas, this would be the year when there's a bigger risk than usual, where there's been summer rainfall. Green pasture as the guide will tell us that if you're in an area where historically you've seen Barbus pole at times, it's a year to look out for it. Moving now to the Mediterranean zones, which is where I am, and parts of other parts of Australia. Again, the same problems as scour worms, but Barbus poles are well known in the high rainfall and coastal areas. A lot of sheep are in a situation like this photo, where it's a decaying crop stubble, and it'll be largely worm-free, as far as anything is worm-free. But most of the worms in that scene are going to be actually in the sheep, and many of them will be drench-resistant worms that survived a drench. But either way, we need to be ready for autumn. So we've had a very dry year in most of the Mediterranean zones, so no immediate worm risk. But same thing with the rest of winter rainfall areas. We need worm egg counts to be very low by mid-autumn, and especially no more so than in ewes that are going to be dropping lambs in autumn. Winter lambing ewes very, very often will have positive worm burdens and need treatment. We should be checking that with the worm egg count anyway, but certainly with autumn lambing ewes, we need to know where they are, because the lambs have got a long way to go from the time that they're on the ground to the time when worms might cut out in summer in the Mediterranean zone. Now, Barbus pole is a risk in certain areas, as I mentioned, in these zones, and people will know that from past history. If you're in WA last year, quite a few people on the south coast suffered some pretty big Barbus pole worm problems, and a lot of that came back to rain through autumn. And if we again have late summer or autumn rain, then it could occur again. But using the green pasture index gives us a guide, but we then need to follow up with worm egg counts to check where we are, and indeed if the potential is coming through to the point where we've got a real problem. So I'm moving now to the first of my tools, and pretty appropriate. I'm talking about for worm egg count monitoring for each of the regions. And I guess it's pretty much a no-brainer that worm egg counts have become an effective part of effective worm management. If we went back, say, 30 years, it wouldn't have been the case. Worm egg counts are largely a research tool, but now they're really very much part of any worm control program, because part of the idea of reducing our total dependence on drenches means we need to know where we are with worms in the sheep. So we use worm egg counts to tell whether an outbreak of worms, or at least of a problem in sheep, is due to worms. Scouring isn't always due to worms, and sudden deaths aren't always due to Barbus pole. So we can easily check that. We use worm egg counts for drench resistance tests. We'll talk about that a bit more. We use them for selecting worm-resistant sheep if you're a ram breeder. But I guess the one I want to concentrate on most of all is support for worm control programs. So particularly where the sheep are okay as we stand, but we need to know where they are as part of our overall program. So here we are. I guess sort of the issues that I'd break it down to is checking for possible production loss. When sheep have been okay for some time, happily grazing, look okay, and nothing to the naked eye, haven't been in the yards to sort of check them in recent times. Is there, though, a small or moderate worm burden which is eating away at their growth rate, their condition in older animals, wool growth, and so forth. So it may be that the sheep look okay, but they've got an average of 250 eggs per gram, which is probably getting somewhere where we might think a drench is getting justified. I guess also supporting the worm control programs, looking at worm egg count levels at particular times of the year. So I've just mentioned having very low worm egg counts in ewes pre-lambing. We'd use the very low figure. I would use the very low figure of around about 100 eggs per gram is about as far as I let it go before I'd be wanting to treat and get those counts down as low as they can, because they're only going to rise if we don't do that. But there'll be many situations where that planned drench, let's say we're giving a pre-lamb drench, it could be we could be talking about do we need a summer drench to animals? Is that drench justified, or the count simply way too low to justify that? Over the course of some years, we'll get an idea. Most times we'd know that, say, weaners going to summer are going to need a drench, but it may well be worth checking with ewes. Maybe they don't need a drench depending on what the count is. But pre-lamb ewes, of course, particularly vital that we do know where we are. And I could mention too that we'll be talking about low worm paddocks shortly, but for planning a safe pasture policy, if we've got some idea of what at least a couple of times worm egg count levels were, we can make some sort of guesstimate as to the worminess of a particular paddock, whether it's going to be any use for us to sort of plan ahead for, say, using, say, for lambing on, say, for moving lambs onto. So the more information we have, the better prepared we are. Sampling for worm egg counts, of course, pretty simple, and I guess everyone who's tuned in here will have done this. Bunching up sheep, could be in a corner of a paddock or middle of a paddock, wherever the sheep happily mob up. Let them stand for a little while because they'll be a bit nervous with someone there and a ute and maybe a dog or two, and they'll drop plenty of pebbles. The centre photo is probably one I'd mention, being picked up by a chap very virtuously with wearing a glove. But probably most important, the sample in there, you can see in the container, is steaming a bit, condensing on the inside of the jar. That tells us that it's a fresh sample, and we need samples to be fresh. If they picked up a pasture, say, when they've been there a day or two, worm eggs mostly be dead, and we get a false reading from our worm egg count. So we need to pop them into the jar or a plastic bag or whatever container, and if they don't steam, throw them out and get another. Even if it's a really hot day, 40 degrees C, if you're out there in that temperature, and the sample's been freshly passed within the last 10, 15 minutes or so, it'll still steam. That tells us that the sample is one that we want, we can trust will have the worm eggs. So having done that, the sampling is the simple part. Obviously, it's logistics of getting it to whoever's going to do the count for you. But we then use the word interpretation of the results rather than simply reading the results off a sheet. We have an idea of various broad bands in terms of worm egg count numbers that indicate problems, and it's easy when the counts are either very low, close around to the 0 mark, or if they're pretty high, in the high hundreds of worm eggs per gram. But in between, we need to bring in various sort of factors in terms of age of sheep and the drenching history and the sort of pasture it's been, the sort of season, lots of factors that come into that. But I guess a couple of things that we can control or make add a bit more certainty to is that realise that worm egg counts are only an estimate. We're taking a small number of counts out of a flock of whatever size of sheep it is. So the question then is, how accurate is the worm egg count result? We'll have a bit of a look at that in a minute. And secondly, there's difference between the worm types in terms of how many eggs they lay and a few other points. So we need to bear in mind that a worm egg count result does need a little bit of thought behind it before we take action. So here's my my graph of a whole lot of, excuse me, in this case, 220 sheep. This is a research trial we did some time ago, but 220 odd sheep sampled individually. So we do, in this case, have the count of every one of those in the mob, which is, of course, not the usual thing. But we can see, looking there, if we look at the scale on the left-hand side, it tells us down at 0, almost half of the animals there had a 0 count. Not uncommon in many situations. But then we look at the other side, to the right-hand side, and we see that there's some animals there are up over the 1,000 eggs per gram mark. I think the highest was 1,100 in this particular case. So this sort of ski jump, or an 80-20 rule, where 20% of the sheep carry 80% of the worms, or have 80% of the worm count, is pretty common with worm egg counts in a mob of sheep or cattle or camelids or goats. And we need to take account of that when you think of our sampling. So in this case, the average was 145, pretty low, but it varied between up to 1,100, as I said. But I guess the point of interest is that 75% of them, 3/4 of the counts, are actually below the average. So if we're taking a small number of samples out of that flock, the question is, how accurate is our count going to be? By sheer chance, we could have got most of what are the bulk of counts, low counts, in the below the average, and come up with an underestimate. It could be by sheer chance that somehow we sampled some of the animals that are in the higher side, and we get an overestimate. There's always quite a range around, a range of uncertainty around any worm egg count that we get. So we can increase that accuracy, and the very obvious thing would be to sample more sheep. So my example, there were 220 sheep. Let's say you had a flock of 500 sheep, and you're taking 10 samples, which seems to have been the minimum that's, I guess, is part of the general rule that we've adopted in Australia. But I think a lot of people in the game would say that that's too low. It's okay for the very low counts where they're all extremely low or they're high, and we know in each case what the action is. You don't need a drench on one, the other, a drench is certainly needed. But once we get into the mid-range values, where we're more worried about is there potential for a worm problem to develop, or are we talking about possible production loss, then moving up to at least 20 samples or more certainly increases the accuracy. There's a lot of mathematics behind this to tell us about the increase in samples, but certainly moving from 10 to 20 gives us a big improvement in accuracy, and then it tails off as you take more. Now, cost-wise, obviously, you'd think counting 10 samples is going to be it's only half as much as if you do count 20 samples. There's other methods. I mentioned here what's called a bulk count method, which the worm egg count providers will be familiar with. Cost effective because you do fewer, you bulk the samples together, do a smaller number of counts, but come up with still an accurate answer to tell us what the average is for the flock. But because it's been taken from a larger number of animals, it'll be closer to what we'd call the true average of the flock. There's also more sensitive worm egg count methods that we can use, and some of those are coming into various laboratories around Australia. I'm not going to go into the pros and cons of the several different methods there are, but what I would say, it's worth talking to your worm egg count provider regarding the methods they use, I guess the quality control they apply, and sampling as well, regarding doing more samples and so forth, because there's information comes to them regarding I guess how we can make sure that we get the best result from a worm egg count. I mentioned earlier that different worm types have different numbers of worm eggs. It's mostly really between Barbus pole worm and the scour worms, lumping them all together. They have fairly similar numbers of worm egg output, whereas Barbus pole worm puts out many more worm eggs. So one way we can pick between a worm egg count from where Barbus pole is present is that it often has much higher worm egg counts. So if a high count for where scour worms is 500 or 600 eggs per gram, for Barbus pole it's more likely 4,000 plus. And we can see this in a worm egg count, but you still need experience in interpreting what the count might be. We can send off the samples to a parasitology lab because they can differentiate, and the photo there shows us some worm larvae. They might look much the same there, but I can assure you there are several. I think there's probably 3 different species at least there, which it's the skilled people in laboratories can pick between, and they can give us a result and tell us that in fact this count is 30% Barbus pole and 70% scour worms, and we can use that in our decision in terms of what we do. And I'd certainly make the point, this will come up again, but for drench resistance testing, we need to know what species we're dealing with, because the resistance pattern varies very much according to the type of worm that's present. So, getting the best worm egg count result, so accurate counts, we need experienced and trained operators, and we then need to match that with getting an interpretation by people who are familiar with the story. ParaBoss helps here. in terms of running a quality assurance program for worm egg count providers, and a large number, close to 100, sign up each year to do a blind test where they sent out samples, which they then do the counts on, and then they're matched by the people organising the program, the QA program, with what they should be, what the bounds are, and whether or not they're getting a result that's acceptable. And then we can match that with advice from what I'm calling ParaBoss certified advisors. There's a course that people can do to become an advisor. Involves it's quite a stringent, online test, but based on the information that's provided on the various ParaBoss websites, not only worms, but flies, lice, ticks, and so forth. And once people have completed that, and then they're competent that way, they certainly have had a good run through of the information on the ParaBoss sites, and connected with industry, they'll be able to put the worm egg counts into context. Obviously, like all vet practices, vets are up with the current recommendations, but we certainly recommend that people do talk to people who actually have some experience in this game. There's a website address there. To find an advisor that also finds us our people who do provide worm egg counts have gone through the QA program. Not to say that people who haven't done the ParaBoss courses won't be fully competent and absolutely know what they're doing and giving a good result. All we can say, though, is the people who have done these courses, we can say that they certainly have the background for it. So I'm now going to turn to worm-safe pastures, or low worm pastures. No such thing as a worm-free pasture, though the one on the right, the picture on the right, might be pretty close to that. So there's sheep in a crop stubble, pretty hot and dry. If you've been over in WA recent times, where inland areas have been 40 degrees for quite some time, and versus the one on the paddock on the left, we don't know the story there. Depends how many worms are in the sheep. But a green pasture like that would, if there's worm eggs going onto it, it's going to be a wormy paddock. But the idea with our worm-safe pastures is to drench sheep into these paddocks, or move them if they have low counts. And the idea is, of course, that no immediate worm disease, because there's going to be no further or very little further increase in worm numbers from the grazing. And we're looking at the effect on sheep production, but especially to reduce the need for drenching. This is one of the mainstays of drench resistance management, is to manage sheep in such a way that they don't need drenching frequently to control worms. They do it themselves, and a big part of that is making sure they're in a paddock where they're not picking up worm larvae the whole time as they graze. So, bit of text to get through here, but we mean basically worm-safe pastures mean that we've got to prevent the deposition of worm eggs onto paddocks when they'll develop to the larval stage. So basically preventing the development of worms on green pasture, so that when sheep graze, they're not going to pick up the worm larvae that develop from the worm eggs and sit there just waiting for sheep or goats or cattle or alpacas to come past. And we get a free kick from some seasonal conditions. So part of the world where I live, through summer, hot, dry summer periods pretty much sterilises pastures of worms. Not maybe totally sterilised, but certainly goes a long way. People who are familiar with drenching sheep into a crop paddock know that they can generally leave those animals alone drench-wise for quite some time. And with barber's pole, we get maybe it's a shorter period depending where you are, but the cold winters that arrest barber's pole worm egg development go a long way to giving us some, a spell from worms, and allows us to manage our program ahead. But in most of the intensive sheep areas, temperatures are not extreme. Now, I say for most of the year, because in the WA, certainly for 3 or 4 months a year, temperatures are pretty extreme, and there's going to the reverse will apply in winter in areas, let's say the tablelands of New South Wales. But where there's some green pasture and temperatures are not extreme, then this is the time, as we've reiterated, worm egg counts develop, larvae survive. So we need to spell those paddocks if we're trying to produce a worm-free pasture where there already is green pasture. We need to spell them for long enough for the larvae to die off. Now, this is going to take 4 to 6 months because the larvae are pretty tough. As I mentioned before, they'll survive for long periods. And we can generally say that if there's been significant numbers of worm larvae develop on a pasture in winter, many of them are still going to be there at the end of spring, sometime later. And often it's not practical or productive, or even simply possible for a pasture management to leave a paddock unstocked with animals for that time. So we need to work around that. And the working around involves basically targeting the worm-safe pastures to the classes that benefit most. We're never going to be in the situation where each time we drench sheep, we can move them to a paddock that's got very few worms on them. So we need to say, well, with a limited number of paddocks that we can prepare ahead, what are the animals that benefit most? And particularly we'd say that ewes due to lamb, as I mentioned, they lose their immunity temporarily through lambing time, or through lactation. So they're certainly sheep that are in their priority class. And weaners in their first year, yet to develop their full worm immunity, so we need to look after them regarding worms. And then we need to look at what options do we have for the paddocks that are available on the farm for the particular sheep that are going to benefit most. So we're already saying that it's not every mob of sheep that's going to be put onto one of these pre-planned paddocks, but the ones that we can plan, we're going to use for the sheep that are going to benefit most for it. So here's some options. I've mentioned before cereal crop stubbles. We know very well that there's no worms in a paddock that hasn't had any sheep on for many months, and then there's hot, dry conditions for part of the time before harvest, then persisting for some time after. Probably the Rolls-Royce. They carry a Rolls-Royce drench resistance risk, which I'll go into later as well. But forage crops, where they've deliberately planted a crop to maybe for putting weaners on later, is a good option. Cattle paddocks are where people graze cattle, and not goats or camelids. Cattle carry different worms from sheep. There's a couple of overlaps, but they're generally not the important ones. So we can graze a paddock with cattle for some time, swap with sheep, and in general, the sheep will be safe certainly from the Barber's pole worm and the brown stomach and most of the black scour species. Unfortunately, goats and alpacas share the same worms as sheep, and also some with cattle. So they're a bit in between and not suitable for creating safe pastures. We can also look at paddocks where we've grazed sheep where we've confirmed with their worming counts that the sheep do have low counts, and often this will be planned around the sort of weather it's been, hot, dry summers, cold, dry winters. And if we know, followed up with some worming counts, that sheep actually had low counts on, even though the paddock would be potentially okay for worms to develop, but if the wormings haven't been going down onto that pasture, then there's far less of a risk. It might not be as safe as, say, a cattle paddock or a forage crop, but for all that, it's going to be a better option than a paddock where there's been, say, an outbreak of worms. Growing cereal crops can be grazed for short periods, of course. We're talking a week or so, maybe a couple at the most, but a move towards there, it's a holiday at least for sheep that are off a normal pasture. Some specific safe grazing strategies. I'm not going to go into these in depth because there's the link at the bottom which spells them out in detail, and really it does need a bit of thought. But basically the aim is to get the most out of the sort of weather conditions we're having at or experiencing over the course of the year, depending on the climate you're in. So smart grazing, especially for winter rainfall areas where involves some intensive grazing for short periods, tied in with the summer drenches. In the areas where we have a winter pull-up of Barber's pole worm, then we can extend the the cold period by a couple of months with strategic drenching. That gives us a benefit, and I've mentioned the cereal crop stubbles as being giving us a close to a worm-free pasture. Now, there is a caution here. Safe pastures have a resistance risk that any worms survive the drench as we put them into that paddock. They're the only ones there. Less of a problem on green pasture, where generally at the green time of the year, sheep are going to be moving between paddocks, and there'll be some opportunity for the resistant worms to be diluted out by non-resistant worms as sheep move around the farm. But it's a bigger risk where sheep move to close to worm-free pastures, no more so than onto cereal crop stubbles during hot, dry summers. Now, there's a link at the bottom because there's a fair bit of I don't know about theory behind this, but certainly there's a few technicalities. We talk about refugia strategies, which is basically providing a refuge for non-resistant worms, ways that we can ensure that some worms that aren't resistant survive through so that they can dilute out resistant worms. And there's more need to apply this if you're in areas where there's going to be a seasonal time when worms really struggle. So Mediterranean environments, especially, where we know that for a period of at least 4, sometimes 5 months, worms are really going to struggle due to the hot, dry conditions, and most of these are cereal zones, so it's a large part of the crop, the farm will be in crop, and where we know there won't be worm larvae waiting. So a lot of planning needed to make sure that we can balance the benefit of the safe pasture with also making sure that we don't increase drench resistance. So there's a link there, and there's quite a lot of information. And obviously, discussing with advisors how we can best do this will give us the best of all worlds. So now my final tool I'm going to talk about. I think it's again, motherhood statement to say that resistance management is a routine part of our worm control, has been for a long time, because we've known that drench resistance is a big cost. If the drenches aren't killing worms, then at the worst case, we won't pull up an outbreak of worm disease. In fact, drench resistance was first recognised when people were drenching sheep that were suffering Barbus pole outbreaks, dead sheep and so forth, and sheep kept dying in the face of that drench. That alerted the scientists of the day to the fact that there's something wrong with drenches, and it wasn't long before we recognised that there'd been a change to worms, too much exposure to drenches, and it allowed a certain part of the worm population there to become resistant. And I guess the rest is history, in that we have a lot of strategies regarding managing drench resistance. But the invisible production loss from smallish worm burdens really is probably the most important in terms of reducing the significance of drench resistance, reducing production, because the small burdens continue for some time. Also, though, of course, the planned worm control programs, we might be talking about a summer drench program or a move to safe pastures. But if we're not killing all the worms, then we're in a situation where worms continue, maybe at those low levels, causing a production loss. We're not aware unless we do some worm egg counts. So worm resistance occurs to all drenches. It varies, though, between the species, the type of drench, and the part of the world we're living in. So should make the point that Barbus pole worm and brown stomach, so Osteiga, Tilbosargia type worms, are the ones with the most potential for developing resistance. They are the ones that we have a special resistance to the ML, the macrocyclic lactone drenches, and so ivermectin, abamectin, moxidectin are the ones in that category. And the resistance is especially common in summer rainfall areas to the macrocyclic lactone drenches to Barbus pole, and in winter rainfall areas, it's in brown stomach worm. So resistance we've known for a long time, especially severe to the white drenches and also the clear drenches, levamisole for the scour worms, and the older macrocyclic lactones, so ivermectin and now abamectin. You can't expect them automatically to work. Most times we'd be recommending a drench combination anyway. So far there is less resistance, we know, from various test information to the drench combinations and the newer drench groups that are on the market. We still do need to test each property, because we can't assume that. But also different regions just make the point that we know there's a lot of resistance to Barbus pole worm in the Barbus pole worm zones. Doesn't mean, though, that there's a lot of resistance to Barbus pole in winter rainfall areas. When it occurs in parts of the world where I work in WA, most times we have a pretty fair array of drenches that are effective. Many of those, though, would not be at all effective if we'd been dealing with the same sort of outbreak in, say, the tablelands of New South Wales. So it's horses for courses. Big variation between individual properties, and cutting to the bottom line there in blue, we need to know what's effective on each property, because there's a different drench history, there's obviously different environments, different times of treatment and so forth. All of these mean that the resistance pattern will vary farm to farm. It's a reason for quarantine drenches so that when we bring a mob of sheep onto the farm, they don't bring worms with them with a different pattern, an unwanted pattern, and bring resistance in that we didn't already have. But it does mean that we need to know what's effective on each property. And we get back here to doing a test. Two main types that we'd be talking about. So drench test or drench check. The link at the bottom spells out. I'm going to spell a little bit of detail in a summary, but there's a chapter and verse at the website regarding drench test versus which tests several drench groups versus a spot check with drench check. So the gold standard is the drench test, where we test several groups of sheep with different types of drench so that we can put together that information and get an idea in terms of what options we might have of the numerous different drench groups, the combinations, the various products and so forth on our particular property. So it basically involves a number of sheep. Generally, we generally set them around about 15. I guess 20 would be better with for each different drench type we're going to test. Then we're comparing them generally with an undrenched control group or with themselves. There's different ways of doing that, and you need to talk to a person who's advising on resistance tests how to do that. We check for a worm ID. Very important that we do know whether we're dealing with resistance to Barber's pole worm versus to the scour worms, because, as we said earlier, that does vary. Tests conducted on lambs or weaners, which reliably have high counts and high sustained counts over the time. And ideally, every couple of years, you do that so that you do a stock take of where you are drench-wise. Things change with time, and there's been, of course, a steady increase in resistance to drenches at some time ago. So let's say abamectin 15 years ago, you'd probably say most times it's going to work. Now I'd say most times it's probably not against most worms. So things move on. We need to check at the time. But I do realise that there's a fair bit of, planning, preparation, and some time and effort goes into doing the full-on drench test. A way, I guess, if we're not going to do that at the time, we can do a drench check. It's a spot test, so when a mob of sheep's in the yards for drenching, we can check how well that drench goes. Pretty easy. Take samples at the time, say 10, ideally 20 sheep. In fact, I would say ideally 20 sheep. 14 days later, 12 maybe at the minimum, but 14 is the ideal thing. So if you've done this on a Tuesday, 2 weeks' time, you nip out into the paddock and take the samples from the paddock. Now, these are different sheep, of course, from almost certainly will be the ones that you tested in the yard. So it reduces the overall accuracy compared to a drench test. But for all that, should give us, if we've got big enough numbers of sheep in the sample, a good idea of how the drench is going. And ideally, again, we'd get a species ID, especially if resistance comes up. If we found we had 500 eggs per gram when we drenched, and when we checked from the paddock, we found that we had, say, 10 eggs per gram, that's been a pretty fair reduction. You might say, okay. But if we found we had, say, 50 or 60 eggs per gram, we've got around the 90% reduction, then it'd be a good idea to know which worms are involved. And certainly sending the sample off to a laboratory, talking to the worm egg count provider about how we do that will be a good idea. But I guess the beauty of a drench check is that over a year we can test several different sort products or drench types, and hopefully put together some idea in terms of the pattern we're seeing, what's going to work and what isn't. So I've reached pretty much the end of my rundown on the various tools. So a very quick summary is that autumn is a key season to get worm control programs running. For Barber's pole, there's still a risk for some time with the worm itself, but we need to be thinking of planning ahead through winter, the time when, or at least in areas where we do have cold winter, and recognising that's not everywhere in Australia, but large parts of our flock do run in areas where winters are cold, and it slows down Barber's pole, and we can use that as a strategic planning program for that worm. Winter rainfall areas, of course, we're really coming out of the time when worms go slow. Now, they won't have gone slow at all in parts of large parts we know of Eastern Australia. They will in the west. But for all that, we need to be aware that once we enter the green feed time of the year after seasonal rains, then worms are ready to go. And we need to plan with low worm egg counts ahead so that winter and spring worm burdens don't get out of control. Worm egg counts have long been a staple of worm control management, but I guess it's still one way that we can make sure that we're on top of likely worm problems, but also that we don't over-drench and push towards developing more in the way of drench resistance. Worm-safe pastures, I guess, says it all, big benefits, but needs planning and prioritising. And certainly it won't be that every flock has a worm-safe pasture ahead of it as it moves from paddock to paddock, but there are some that need it more than others. It does need planning ahead, but there's various options that allow us to do that. Checking for drench resistance, I say essential and easy. I think both of those apply. Certainly essential to know where you are, because the pattern will vary farm to farm, and your farm will be different from, and certainly if you own several properties, even they could be different depending on stock movement policies. But essential to know where you stand, but also fairly easy to do. The drench check is a fairly easy and logical way. Sheep are in the yards, and then sampling them, then sampling from the paddock. But a full drench test, of course, gives you the more complete information, and doing that every couple of years is a pretty good move regarding marrying into your worm control program and making sure you get the best out of your overall worm control program, including safe pasture policies. So I'm happy to leave it at that. Thanks, Fiona, and happy to take questions.
Thanks, Brown. I have a couple of questions that have already come through, but if we'd like to keep question time going, we need to get some good questions going at Brown. You've got him here, so ask away. It's a great opportunity. So our first question has come through, and it is about preparing lambing paddocks. They're after a little bit more information to help reduce worm burdens for winter and spring lambing, Brown, and they're located in southwest Victoria.
Okay, they're located in a pretty wormy part of the world, and I guess that's obviously means that worms will survive longer on pasture. I guess the first part regarding pre-lamb drenches and so forth. One issue is that any drenches you give need to be fairly close to lambing time. So 2-3 weeks out, really, any further away from that, it's not really a pre-lamb drench, because the ewes have the opportunity to pick up more worms. 2 to 3 weeks out, ewes prior to actually dropping the lamb, they're generally fairly resistant to worms, ewes in good body condition. So I guess that's needs to be I guess the timing of a pre-lamb drench in relation to when the lamb's going to drop is important. Obviously, there's a time when you don't want to be yarding heavily pregnant ewes. Long-acting drench types, long-acting moxidectin injection is, of course, frequently used. That gives us a longer period of time against several of the major worm types. Need to be aware there's a larger drench resistance risk with that. It can be managed. A lot of information regarding how we do that on the WormBoss site. But either way, I guess the key thing is to know ahead what we need in the way of a pre-lamb drench, because lactation is certainly the time that ewes are going to fire that up. So options, really, it depends. It's going to be harder creating safe pastures in the part of the world we're talking about, southwest Victoria. If green pastures persist right through summer, it may well be a year, and of course years vary in terms of the worm risk. Years where we're a really dry year, it's going to be somewhat easier. There, really, we go back to what information do we have from different flocks in the pasture and around on the farm. And at times, too, some of the information might be a little bit secondhand from other mobs, and we need to make some guesstimate. Ideally, though, planning ahead, we will have worm egg count information some months ahead on particular paddocks, knowing where they stand. If people happen to have cattle, then that's a gift. Obviously, cattle and sheep have different sort of pasture grazing needs, and that needs to be managed. But I guess in the end, knowledge regarding the worm status and the worm egg counts from particular grazing flocks is probably is a very important part of planning worm safe pastures in a zone where we know very well that worms are favoured and larvae are going to survive for long times.
Great, thanks, Brown. Lots of questions are flooding in now, so we'll move on as quickly through them as we can. Is it worth investing in equipment or training to do your own worm egg counts on farm, Brown?
I'd say only if you really like sitting at microscopes and are happy to do that, and a lot of people are and do. And for sure, if you do that, though, I guess the proviso is that you do receive the training, and that you then make sure that you're actually doing it, getting a good, an accurate result. One of the benefits, of course, is doing it yourself. I mean, it's not just simply a cost thing. I guess it's an ease availability thing. It probably also means, though, that you'll be able to do more in the way of larger numbers of flocks. that you can sample. The actual equipment is not particularly expensive and easy enough to obtain. But the issue then is training. So before you invest it at all, you'd want to make sure that you actually have access to someone who does a good job or who's credible in the worm control, in the worm accounting field, and can provide that training. You also then shouldn't assume that simply because you've learnt, then away you go, and just like driving a car, you drive forever without anyone checking on you. That you do periodically do some backup. I mentioned the worm QA program. There's a number of producers, in fact, who do their own worm accounts, who do sign up for that and receive the samples, and so they know that they're providing an accurate result. So a bit of thought involved, but certainly quite a few people do their own worm accounts. With that, of course, goes, I guess, access to advice in terms of what you do with that count, what do we do with that result. But certainly quite a few producers successfully do their own worm accounts.
Thanks, Brown. Next question, where can we acquire a farmer chart, colour chart from? I know there's one on our website, but do you know where you can get one, a hard copy of one?
I'm afraid I don't. It's a thing we can chase up. The FarmerChar people who develop it. So FarmerChar, for those people who are not familiar with it, it's specific for Barber's poleworm, but it's a guide to anemia, to blood status, blood situation of sheep, knowing very well that sheep that are heavily infected with Barber's poleworm are highly anemic, so that they whitish membrane. So it's actually based on looking at the membranes around the eye, which will go progressively from their normal reddish pink colour for a sheep in good health, right through to a dull pink to even white. A sheep that's had a lot of blood sucked from it by specifically Barber's pole. There's other things that cause anemia, but mostly we can work the factors around it will drive us towards Barber's pole being the issue. So, but FarmerChar has been used as a way of checking the relative situation. It does involve yarding sheep and checking a large number of sheep in a flock. Can be, in fact, ideally every one of them, and ideally you'd need to be doing it fairly frequently. So it generally has meant that it's mostly been smaller flocks in the past. I think people who run quite small flocks, it's an absolutely ideal way to go. Worm accounting, it's actually means you're doing it on your farm yourself for no cost versus worm accounting, so it can be done, I guess, more frequently. But it does mean you need the chart. The actual what's available on ParaBoss, the WormBoss site, is pretty accurate. But the actual colours themselves, the people who originated FarmerChar are pretty specific about what those colour ranges should be for each. It's actually a 5-point scale. So it's a thing I think, Fiona, we could probably chase up, actually, where you get hard copies. Normally, hard copies are only provided for people who've done a FarmerChar course. But I don't know if they're a bit more liberal there, recognising that it's not easy to get to do a FarmerChar course.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Brown. Next question, and it comes up a lot, so thanks for asking. This one's from Philip. Are kangaroos a host for common worm species? That's
an easy one. No. We're lucky that unlike some other countries in around the world where they have things like deer and so forth that carry parasites, our native animals don't carry any of the parasites that are significant in livestock control, worm control in Australia.
Thanks, Brown. Would you comment on long-acting versus short-acting drenches? Should you be avoiding long-acting drenches for as long as possible to reduce resistance, and how do you protect them?
I guess that's a pretty contentious one that comes up quite plainly. There's a benefit in the long-acting drench when it works, and I really would underline that, when it works. Because giving the drench means for up to 3 months. That for some species, 91 days is the registered claim for a couple of species for the long-acting moxidectin. It's the only one available. The capsules, long-acting drench capsules, are largely faded out. We don't know if they'll reappear, but we're generally talking about long-acting moxidectin injection. And providing it's working, does give us a holiday in that flock for that length of time. The only problem is that over that time, it means that any resistant worms that are either left after that drench or are picked up off the pasture over the course of the time that the long-acting drench is in action, they're the worms that come to the fore. By the time the long-acting product finishes, pays out, then these are the only ones that are left in the system. So it does have an effect in terms of exacerbating or accelerating drench resistance. There's ways to manage it. There's a lot of information on the WormBoss site about that. Probably won't go into everything now, but it certainly involves prioritising the flocks that benefit most. Treating everything with a long-acting drench at the same time on the farm be about the worst thing I think you could do for developing drench resistance, but there's almost never a need for that anyway. Again, it's a question of prioritising the ones that benefit, where worm problems have historically have occurred most, or where the conditions tell us might be most likely, and using those products there, but then also making sure there's areas on the farm where animals haven't received that drench, or indeed that type of drench. So a bit of planning involved there. There's also strategies regarding doing a drench with other drench products at the same time you give the long-acting drench, so you knock out any resistant worms, and then following up with worm egg counts along the way. So a fair bit of management, but provided that we manage the risk with long-acting products, then I do believe they have a role. Just need to be aware of the need to consider them not simply another drench.
Thanks, Brown. One of the people in the audience has just messaged in with the contact on where you can get Farmer cards from, and I've just put it in the chat for everybody. So you're welcome to go to the chat and have a look for those details if you're interested. Thank you very much for that. Next question. What are your thoughts on new fluke risks in Central West New South Wales, Brown?
Out of my comfort zone there regarding new fluke risk in terms of sure, I presume this is a weather related question, but sorry, I'm not. I mean, obviously anything that's going to favour the survival of the snail is going to push things towards the fluke. But yeah, no, I don't think I can get enough information to give an answer there.
No worries. All good. Staying with new things. Any new drenches in development?
I honestly have to say, not that I know of, or anyone I've spoken to in the field really has mentioned. From time to time, we do see reports in the scientific journals regarding a new molecule that someone's discovered or something that looks promising. Almost always they fizzle out after a short time. We hear nothing more. The exception was when some time ago, it's probably now 15 years, that monopantal and then Derquantal came along. We knew about those. When say we, I guess the technical community knew about those 5 and 6 years before they actually came to the market. So I'd expect that if there's anything in development in a serious way, we probably could say that we've got some idea. That wouldn't necessarily mean that it would make it through to the market, but I think the short answer is here is that we can't expect there's anything coming to our rescue that way. We've got to manage with what we have. I think probably the good thing to note is that by the time the new molecules came along, so monopantal as in Zolvix and Zolvix Plus, and Derquantal, ivermectin as Startect, by the time those new products came along, we'd already developed a lot in the way of drench resistance management strategies, and as a rule, most producers were incorporating those sort of strategies. So those drenches came along at a good time that way, and any new drench you'd hope would be in a similar situation where we've got a lot of information, a lot of management policies on the ground that mean that they're not going to go down the gurgler the same way that some of the older drenches did.
Thanks, Brown. What drenches would you recommend for fluke in sheep?
For fluke in sheep, well, obviously triclobendazole has been the mainstay there, but of course, we're aware that resistance is developing, or in some properties has developed to triclobendazole. I think and there's a range of other drenches, Closantel and various others that do have an effect against fluke, and depends on the risk and time of year. I think that's very much a question where you need to talk to a local advisor who's in touch with the local situation, especially regarding triclobendazole resistance, and the I guess relative risk for class of stock and so forth. So I think that's fairly specific to a region. But we do need to be aware though that any any parasite is capable, it seems, of developing resistance, and liver fluke's been no exception to that rule.
Thanks, Brown. A couple of Barbavax questions. You weren't going to get let off the hook that easily. So will Barbavax reduce burdens in paddocks, and is it effective long term?
It's not an antiemetic. So giving it to in fact, well, when I say it's not an antibiotic, folks are not aware of Barbavax, specific to Barber's poleworm. So it's a vaccine only against Barber's poleworm. It needs to be given typically a couple of priming doses, roughly 6 weeks apart. Usually as a lamb, they'd be given at possibly marking and then at weaning or pre-weaning, and then full activity of the vaccine really only hits after the 3rd injection. So it needs to be given roughly 6 weekly, I guess, starting prior to the main Barber's pole season in a particular zone. So I guess it's a vaccine. It does require those several hits, but regarding its effect, once giving it to a flock that's already suffering Barber's poleworm, it's not a good strategy, because Barber's pole, the intent of the vaccine is to keep Barber's poleworm low in the flock and across the farm, so it never really gets out of hand anyway. It does have some effect. So yes, giving the vaccine, you'd reduce burdens by maybe 40–50%. It does have some effect that way over the course of the week or so after the vaccine, but it's nowhere near as good as an effective drench, and it's not going to. In the face of continual heavy worm challenge, the vaccine isn't as effective as if it's been given prior to the main Barber's pole season. So it's very much a thing to plan ahead, so that I guess sometime springtime normally would be when we'd be thinking about starting starting Barbavax in a flock, so that the sheep have got their immunity from the vaccine ready for the time when the Barber's pole risk period begins.
Thanks, Brown. There's certainly more information about Barbavax on our website on ParaBoss, and also Barbavax has their own website that you can put in questions and people will get back to you with answers. So there'll be more information there for you to have a look at. Couple of questions left, and we're still holding on to our attendees mostly, so they're enjoying question time, Brown. Next question is breeding sheep with natural immunity. Is it a thing? Should she be culling which sheep show a high worm burden or not? What's your thoughts?
I guess, certainly breeding for worm resistance, or at least bringing in, it's generally rams, because they have the biggest effect on the flock, of course. Has been in a standard recommendation for many years, and there's certainly some ram breeders have got to the point where their rams are extremely low. So if you're following the genetic sites, the ASBVs for breeding values for rams, or very high for worm resistance. So I guess the starting point is bringing in rams that way. Breeding on your own farm, of course, I guess means that you're basically needing to test pretty much every sheep, and that's you could breed your own rams and test only what are going to male progeny, but testing individual sheep and culling ones that have high burdens. Actually, that does have a positive effect. It's one thing that people use the Famachar we've talked about earlier for, because people are assessing, experienced folk can assess some hundreds of sheep in a day, and individuals that persistently come back. And in fact, in South Africa, where this is used very commonly, every sheep that comes through that has a high count on the Famachar score, they'll drench it, but at the same time they put a plastic tie around around one of the legs, and then they're doing this frequently. By the time I think that an animal's got 3 of these ties, in other words, 3 times in a row that it's shown it's suffering from Barber's pole, they'll cull it. And and that way you're reducing animals most at risk on the one hand, but also they are the ones putting very large numbers of worm eggs onto the pasture and making things worse for the rest of the flock. So yes, in theory that would work, and if you had a small flock where you could easily test every animal and economically do that, that would be a reasonable way to go. But generally, when we're talking about properties running thousands of sheep, really, it's doing a single one spot check. If you did say, I'm going to bite the bullet and do a worm test on say 6,000 sheep, at great cost, sure, it's still only a spot way to go. So I think it's very much something for small flocks where you can do every animal. Otherwise, I think the best way of using the genetic resistance, which undoubtedly has an effect, albeit over a longer term, but undoubtedly does have a big beneficial effect in reducing the overall worminess of a flock, is to concentrate on bringing in rams that have been tested and scored to have a high breeding value for worm resistance.
Thanks, Brown. Final question I have for the moment. So last opportunity to ask anything of Brown before we sign off today. Has there ever been any research looking into a pasture spray to kill worm larvae?
Answer is, I guess there has, on very small, sort of a very small scale. Most times the reason that it hasn't really been looked at is that to have any effect, you need to be really soaking the pasture, not simply, say, like a herbicide where a couple of drops of a herbicide on one leaf will kill an entire plant. Here we're talking about worm larvae, which are low to the ground, and proportion will actually be below the ground surface. So, in fact, the general thought is that general figure is that 95% of worm larvae are within 2 inches of the ground, and a percentage of them are, in fact, under the ground. So pretty hard to get to kill. You'd need to be talking about close to a flood irrigation situation. And I guess for that reason, it's put people off. One other thought is too that a chemical that's going to kill larvae is probably going to kill beneficial microbes in the soil, earthworms, and so forth, and various beetles and so forth. So chemical sterilising of soil that way is, generally not being considered an attractive option. I've never seen any commercial scale development that way. I guess in the end, it does get back to using what we can from nature in terms of the times of the year when worms of the target species aren't going to be doing well on the pasture, and then following that up with some objective information through a worm count in terms of, in fact, what is the worm risk here, and using those two, I guess, pieces of information to develop a worm-safe pasture. It comes up from time to time, and I think here and there people have actually found that by saturating the soil with some of the drenches, you can actually kill the worm larvae as well. Some don't actually even kill the larvae. You'd be looking at other chemicals, but I guess I can honestly say, as a practical thought, just can't see it going anywhere.
Thanks, Brown. Have there been any advancements recently in goat information for worms, and where would the best place be to look for it, do you think?
I guess it's true that most information regarding goats come from our knowledge of worms with sheep. Certainly the biology of the worms and so forth does, and that's fair enough because it's very much the same. Probably the point to make is the goats in general are considered to be more wormy on a scale. So if we think of sheep as, this is a pretty rough scale, but sheep as being a pretty worm-prone species, goats are more worm-prone, alpacas somewhat less worm-prone than sheep, and cattle less worm-prone again. With all exceptions across the board, because you certainly can have worm problems in cattle. But I guess we need to be aware that goats do seem to have less of a less developed natural immunity to worms than do to sheep, and of course they have a different grazing habit, which changes their whole access to worm larvae. But so I'm not aware of new information regarding goats. ParaBoss or WormBoss does in fact specifically mention goats in a number of sections, and very deliberately where there are differences that actually mean that we need to manage goats differently, then WormBoss does pick that up. But I think it's probably fair to say that pound for pound, managing worms in goats is slightly more difficult than it is with sheep. I'm talking about goats in intensive areas, mind you. Different story if we're talking goats in pastoral areas, as it is with sheep. But I guess if we're talking about equivalents of animals running on improved pastures, then worm controlling goats certainly needs perhaps at least as much attention. Worm counts still work well in goats, of course, as they do in all species.
Great, thanks, Brown. That brings us to the end of question time. Thank you everyone for joining us today. It was a great webinar and a lot of questions. I love it for your time. It was great to have you back on. we go into the afternoon now, and you now get to spend the rest of the day starting your day because you're quite a bit behind us. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yep, time for a cup of coffee, but yeah, thanks, and always happy for any follow up. If Fiona could direct questions, I'm happy to follow up individually if people do have questions. So
excellent.
Yeah, thanks.
Well,
thanks for the chance.
Are up on screen now, so if anyone has anything that they need, just let us know. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next month. Bye for now.